Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're going to be looking at something pretty interesting today. Genteel poverty.
Ooh.
Yeah, it's a term I think that, maybe some people have heard it,
Mm-hmm.
but might not know like what it actually means.
Yeah.
And so we've got some sources today, including a really nice overview from Wikipedia, and we're going to deep dive into this idea. What does genteel poverty mean?
Yeah.
And where does this term come from? And is it something that we even see today?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's interesting about this is that it's not just poverty. It's this poverty that's linked to a connection or affectation to a higher social class.
Right.
So our sources are defining it as a state of poverty often experienced by individuals who have experienced a decline in wealth. So it's like there's a contrast.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's not just like being destitute.
Right.
It can even extend to the lower middle class, according to our sources.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to be looking at some pretty surprising areas, I think, where this topic surfaces.
Yeah.
We're looking at literature.
Mm-hmm.
We're looking at modern interpretations as well, and just trying to get a sense of, like this really interesting kind of social concept.
Yeah, and as we explore this idea, you'll begin to see that genteel poverty offers this unique lens through which to understand social anxieties, the dynamics of class and wealth.
So where did this idea really take hold? Well, our research indicates that the term genteel poverty was most commonly used in the late 19th century.
Okay.
And it's really hard to think about it without thinking about 19th and early 20th century English literature.
Right.
It seems like the writers back then were particularly interested in this idea of characters who weren't working class, but were nonetheless facing some pretty serious financial difficulty.
What's so insightful about these depictions is how they grapple with this loss of identity tied to their former social standing. So it's not just about lacking money, it's this internal conflict of maintaining a self-perception that no longer aligns with their economic reality. So this often manifests as maintaining a certain social appearance or concern for appearances.
Exactly. And think about Jane Austen. Our sources specifically mention her.
Of course.
And makes sense. Because Jane Austen herself experienced a form of genteel poverty after her father's death.
Mm-hmm.
Her novels are full of examples of this. In Emma, we have Miss Bates and Mrs. Bates. They clearly come from a respectable background. Mr. Bates was the clergyman.
Yeah.
But after his death, they've fallen on harder times, constantly having to worry about their finances, but still trying to maintain that social presence in Highbury.
And Sensibility gives us another really clear picture of this with the Dashwood sisters.
Right.
Due to inheritance laws at the time, which favored the male heir from their father's first marriage, they experienced this significant drop in fortune. And this forces them to navigate a social world with these really limited resources, and they're constantly having to make compromises that their previous status would not have required.
Right. And it's not just Austen. Our research brings up Capture the Castle and Little Lord Fauntleroy. I think what's interesting is if you think about Little Lord Fauntleroy, you have this distinction between Cedric Errol, and even when he's living in relatively modest circumstances in America, he has this inherent refinement and this upbringing that sets him apart from the truly working class people that he encounters.
Right.
It wasn't solely about an absence of wealth. It was also about this ingrained sense of class and proper behavior.
Absolutely. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, these literary examples really underscore social realities of the time. Inheritance laws that privileged male heirs the limited avenues for women to earn a living independently. These types of societal structures could very easily push individuals and families from a comfortable position into genteel poverty. Literature then becomes this really powerful way to explore the resulting anxieties and the struggles that people had to keep appearances, which could sometimes be humorous and sometimes tragic.
So who exactly might have found themselves in this situation of genteel poverty? Sounds like it encompasses a pretty wide range of people.
It really does. Our source provides a really helpful breakdown of this. It could certainly include individuals who maybe once held titles, had significant wealth but lost it through poor investments or changing economic tides. But the term also extended down into the lower middle class.
Right.
And very poignantly, it often applied to unmarried women or spinsters from formerly wealthy families. These individuals were often barred from working.
Wow.
And they became reliant on dwindling family resources or uncertain investments.
That really paints a picture, doesn't it? These women who had grown up with certain expectations, and then suddenly they're finding themselves in this very vulnerable position just because of their gender and societal norms.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Our research also mentions aristocratic families that lacked male heirs.
Oh,
So in those cases, family wealth might pass on to a more distant relative, leaving the immediate female members in much more reduced circumstances. Then you also had individuals who were living on fixed incomes like pensions. The income itself might have remained stable, but its purchasing power could have eroded over time due to inflation.
and it also brings up a group that I hadn't immediately thought about,
Hmm.
which is vicars in the Church of England.
Right.
Often they were well-educated,
Mm.
almost part of a, like an intellectual elite,
Mm.
but their income was tied to the often modest financial resources of their local parish.
It's fascinating because even within the working class, the concept could apply to those who possessed a higher level of education or specialized skills.
Okay.
So think about teachers or highly skilled artisans. They might have had what we would consider now cultural capital, things like education,
Mm-hmm.
knowledge, and understanding of social norms. That aligned them more closely to the middle or upper classes, but not necessarily the consistent financial security.
It brings us back to the Little Lord Fauntleroy example.
Mm.
Even when he wasn't traditionally wealthy for a period, his upbringing, his refined manners,
Hmm.
really distinguished him from, the truly impoverished children that he encountered.
Right.
It wasn't just about the money. It was also about that inherited sense of belonging to a certain stratum, even if they didn't have the financial backing.
Precisely. And our source even notes that some of these aristocratic genteel poor might still have retained a few servants. Or they might have lived off relatively small amounts of rental or estate income. So it wasn't necessarily about absolute destitution, but rather the significant decline from their expected standard of living,
Yeah.
coupled with the strong social pressures to maintain appearances that their upbringing had instilled in them.
So this leads us to this idea of pretense, which our research also touches upon. It wasn't just people who had genuinely fallen from a higher class, but it could also describe working class people who consciously adopted the behaviors and affectations
Mhm.
of those they perceived to be of a higher social standing.
Yeah, this raises such an important question about social mobility and aspiration in societies that have these strong class distinctions. It's kind of understandable that some individuals would try to emulate the manners, the speech, even the interests of those who they saw as more successful or belonging to a higher rung on the social ladder.
Right, and so our source gives us this really interesting literary example.
Yeah.
Leonard Bast from E.M. Forster's Howard's End. He's a lower middle class insurance clerk,
Right.
but he's diligently trying to improve himself. Through reading classic literature, attending these cultural lectures,
Mm.
he's clearly trying to strive for something beyond his social position.
Absolutely. And the quote that our research includes from Forster is so telling.
Yeah.
It says, "We are not concerned with the very poor. They are unthinkable." This story deals with gentlefolk, or with those who are obliged to pretend that they are gentlefolk. It really shines a light on this particular English preoccupation with the nuances of class and the lengths that people went to either maintain or ascend the social hierarchy.
It almost sounds like this constant performance of social class.
Yeah.
And genteel poverty existed in this sort of awkward middle ground between genuine wealth and abject poverty.
I think that's a really insightful way to look at it. And it speaks volumes about the social anxieties of the time, the pervasive fear of losing status, the desire for upward mobility, and the immense importance placed on outward appearances.
So what about today?
Hmm.
Is genteel poverty just something that we find in old books, or does it still have relevance in the 21st century?
This is where the modern perspectives that our research brings up become really interesting. Theodore Dalrymple argues that as a significant social phenomenon, genteel poverty had largely faded away by the 1960s and 70s. He suggests that this was due to the decline of the traditional British gentry and the impacts of inflation, which would have diminished the real value of these fixed incomes.
That makes sense when you think about all the big changes that happened back then,
Yeah.
socially and economically.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
However, Paul Graham Taylor offers a slightly different interpretation. Okay.
He proposes that the development of the British welfare state by providing a basic pension essentially created a safety net that could sustain individuals in a state that might be considered genteel poverty. So maybe without those former luxuries, but with this basic level of security, that could allow for some degree of dignity.
That's a really interesting way to reframe it. So maybe the definition or the baseline of what constitutes poverty has shifted, but this underlying feeling of disconnect between your aspirations or background and then your financial reality Maybe that still exists.
Precisely, and our research goes on to introduce a more contemporary angle by suggesting that many individuals working in creative fields today might experience a form of genteel poverty.
Yeah.
They might possess a high degree of cultural capital, things like education, connections within their industry, a deep understanding of cultural trends,
Hmm.
and even a certain amount of social cachet within their circles.
Yeah.
But they often face these inconsistent incomes and a constant struggle to achieve financial stability. Yeah, that really rings true, doesn't it? You see so many incredibly talented people in creative fields who are so passionate about what they do, but they're constantly navigating these precarious financial situations.
Absolutely. And Cosmo Landesman's concept of the undeserving, not quite poor adds another interesting layer to this modern interpretation.
Right.
So he's referring to individuals who might have enough disposable income for small indulgences, but they're still grappling with significant financial burdens like medical debt or the looming uncertainty of retirement savings.
And our source notes that Landsman attributes this partly to a laissez-faire attitude toward personal finances that he associates with the baby boomer generation, combined with a less comprehensive welfare state and a more generally unstable economic environment. It's almost like a modern take on this idea of trying to maintain a certain lifestyle without the solid financial foundation to support it.
What's fascinating here is how the very notion of genteel aspirations might have evolved. Perhaps it's less about inheriting a title or a sprawling estate and more about pursuing a meaningful creative career or maintaining a certain standard of living in this age of economic precarity.
Yeah. And our research also briefly mentions Gillian Godsoll from the Irish Independent and her perspective on contemporary lessons that can be drawn from this idea of genteel poverty. Although the specifics of her argument aren't detailed in our source, it does suggest that these core themes and challenges that are associated with this idea might still offer insights into understanding the financial struggles and social perceptions of today.
Yeah, it reminds us that while the specific historical context of 19th century England was unique, these fundamental human experiences, financial insecurity, social aspiration, the often tricky relationship between outward appearance and the underlying reality, these things persist across time and cultures.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into genteel poverty, we've really covered a lot of ground. We've explored its historical roots, particularly as it was portrayed in 19th century literature. We've seen how it describes a specific kind of poverty linked to a perceived or former connection to a higher social class. We've looked at the diverse groups of people who might have found themselves in this situation, and we've even considered how this concept might be understood and applied in our modern world.
I think what's particularly insightful is how the term itself reflects this very specific set of social structures and anxieties around maintaining status in a rapidly changing world. And while the use of the phrase genteel poverty might have lessened the underlying tensions that it represents, that gap between our aspirations and our economic realities continues to resonate in various ways.
Absolutely. This leaves you with a final thought. Could the challenges faced by many modern creatives, or those navigating the uncertainties of the gig economy, be considered a contemporary form of genteel poverty? They often possess significant cultural capital and ambition, but may lack the traditional financial security that might have been expected in previous generations. It really makes you think about how our current societal values and economic structures are shaping our understanding of poverty and class today. Definitely something worth pondering. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
Thank you.